busy week at Matt's, and everyone's probably tired, but thank you for taking some time to come out and listen today. My name is Maggie Dawson. I am the Freedom Drivers Project Specialist with Truckers Against Trafficking, also known as TAT. And today I'm going to be speaking to you all about the realities of domestic sex trafficking and how Truckers Against Trafficking is partnering with members of the industry to combat this crime. As I get started, I do want to give a content advisory. I will be talking about sexual and physical abuse in this presentation. I'm also going to make a reference to some mental health issues, so just want everyone to be mindful of that as we get started. There we go, great. All right, so to begin, let's define human trafficking. Human trafficking is the exploitation of human beings through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of either commercial sex or forced labor. I'm going to stop there for a minute and kind of unpack that a little bit. Victims of human trafficking have been exploited in several different facets of the commercial sex industry. They have been exploited through street-based prostitution, through both legal and illegal brothels. Victims have also been trafficked in strip clubs. We have spoken to trafficking survivors whose pimps were out in the audience while they were dancing and they were soliciting dates for them. And then those victims were forced to perform sex acts on clients afterwards. Victims have also been found in the pornography industry. Some victims are forced by their trafficker to participate in the filming of adult videos. They have also been forced by their buyers to reenact scenes from different pornographic films. On the forced labor side, victims of trafficking have been found in the agricultural sector, on construction sites, in restaurants or hotels. They've also been found in domestic work, like cooks or nannies or housekeepers. In both the commercial sex side and the forced labor side, there's the third party, the trafficker, who is exploiting the victim and making a profit off of them. Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. Some people are curious how a victim allows themselves to come under the power of a trafficker. It's important to understand that a trafficker is going to use different tactics with the victim in order to exert that control. A trafficker could use any one of these tactics or a combination of the three. Force could be something like beatings, rape, gang rape, branding, or the deprivation of food and water. Fraud is the promise of one thing, but the delivery of another. So for example, we worked with a survivor back in January who had filled out what she thought was a legitimate job application for a modeling opportunity, and it turns out that the traffickers used her personal information and then forced her into a situation where she then needed to have sex with clients for money. And coercion is threats. So it could be a threat against the victim themselves. If you don't do this, I'll beat you. It could be a threat against a loved one. If you don't do this, I'll hurt your child. Or if you don't do this, I'll kill your parents. A trafficker is going to be savvy, and they're going to know which of these tactics will be the most effective on a specific victim. I'm going to take a couple minutes here to make a distinction between the crimes of smuggling and trafficking. These two terms are often used interchangeably, which can create some confusion, but they are two very distinct issues. Smuggling is a crime against a country's immigration laws. It requires movement. So an individual might pay another person to smuggle them into another country. That is consensual. That requires that movement across the border. Even though the term trafficking sounds like it might require movement, it does not. Trafficking is a crime against a human being. And like I just described, it's when that victim is compelled through that force, fraud, or coercion to be exploited. It does not require movement. So we at Truckers Against Trafficking have a coworker named Liz who is a survivor of trafficking. And starting at the age of 6 years old, I'm going to pause there and let that sink in. Most of us wouldn't let a 6-year-old cross the street by themselves. But at the age of 6, Liz's mother began selling her to men for sex. Liz, obviously at the age of 6, was too young to be sent out into public on her own. So these buyers would either pick her up at the school bus stop or come directly to the family's home in order to rape her. Without leaving her bedroom, Liz became a trafficking victim. Now, there are absolutely situations where someone who was smuggled into the country becomes a trafficking victim. A trafficker might exploit the fact that they don't speak the language or they need a job, and then they can coerce that person into being trafficked. But they are not the same thing, and the majority of trafficking victims in the United States are American citizens, and they are being trafficked domestically. Go ahead and take a couple minutes and look at these bullet points behind me. These are different vulnerabilities that a trafficker might exploit in order to profit off of another human being. And as you're taking a look, I wanted to share a case study with you. So prior to coming to TAT, I worked for a youth advocacy organization. And we received a referral for a 12-year-old girl. She was a young woman of color. She was being raised along with her 8 siblings by a single mom. She had been referred to our program because she had gotten into trouble with law enforcement and the juvenile justice system after bringing marijuana to school. This young girl had some mental health struggles, and after expressing some suicidal ideation, she was taken to a residential treatment center in order to receive services. One day, while she was at the center, she and 2 other girls went on the run from the center. They made it about 2 miles away from the center to a Target that was at the intersection of 2 major highways in Denver. While they were there, they were spotted by 2 men who were in the parking lot who approached them and asked if they needed a ride. And the girls said yes. These men then took these girls about 40 miles north of where they started to a home with the intention of selling them for sex. Now, fortunately, this young lady was able to escape. She found a phone, she called her mom, law enforcement responded, and the perpetrators were arrested. But when you look at this list of vulnerabilities behind me, you can see how many of those boxes that young girl ticks. And you can see that the trafficker was able to identify some vulnerable youth that they were then able to manipulate with the intention of making a profit. Now, not all trafficking victims are going to have those multiple vulnerabilities. Some might have just one. But a trafficker is still going to be able to identify somebody that they can manipulate and somebody that they feel like they can prey upon so they can exert control over them. And traffickers are very aware of systemic problems that we have in this country with things like poverty or racism or the fear of law enforcement, and a trafficker can use those things to their advantage in order to exploit another person. When we talk about trafficking, there are 3 fundamental truths it's important to understand. And the first is that slavery still exists. Even though it is illegal to own another human being, traffickers routinely enslave, torture, and profit off of their victims. So this slide unfortunately got cut off, but according to the International Labor Organization, there are over 50 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. This is a highly lucrative industry, and traffickers net $150 billion in profits from exploiting other human beings. Trafficking cases have been found in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., in urban, suburban, and rural areas. And like we saw on the previous slide with those vulnerabilities, there are thousands of children in the United States who are at risk of being prostituted every year. Victims of human trafficking are disproportionately women and girls of color. And this slide got cut off, but it's important to note those are large numbers that I just said, and it's a little hard to sometimes wrap your mind around the scope of this issue. But if you narrow it down to the impact on a single victim might be raped up to 20 times a day. Think about the amount of trauma that a single sexual assault can have on a victim and multiply that to many times during a day over a long period of time. And you can think about the devastating nature of this crime on a victim. That is why we want to address this problem. The second truth about trafficking is that a trafficker can be anybody. Now, if I asked you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine what comes to mind when I use the word pimp, you probably have some pretty specific imagery that comes to your mind, thanks to movies, music videos, other cultural influences. But the fact is that a pimp, a trafficker, could be anybody. So these individuals pictured behind me are people who have all been charged with human trafficking. You can see there's not one single gender, not a single race, not a single socioeconomic status. The man who's pictured in the upper left-hand side used to be a firefighter, and pictured directly below him was an Army veteran. And the woman who's pictured in the upper right-hand side of the screen was India's Deputy Consul General for the state of New York, and she was arrested for trafficking after fraudulently obtaining a visa for her housekeeper, bringing her to the United States, and then forcing her to work for 16 hours a day for only $3 an hour. This is a crime of power, control, and greed, and anybody could be a trafficker. The third truth that's important to note is that it's really easy for us to want to believe that this is happening far away. This is happening in other countries, it's somebody else's problem. But the fact is that human trafficking is a local crime. It's happening in your communities, and it's happening in your industry. And it requires a homegrown, localized response. If you were to take out your smartphone, your tablet, whatever instrument you wanted, and just Google human trafficking in the United States, it is very easy to find headlines of ongoing human trafficking investigations that are occurring. It took me literally about 2 minutes to find all of these headlines that I have listed here of ongoing human trafficking cases that span the nation. This is a case which some of you may be familiar with. It involves these two individuals, Laura Sorensen and Aldair Hadza. In January 2015, Sorensen and Hadza pulled an RV into the parking lot of a truck stop just outside of Richmond, Virginia. The RV looked a little suspicious, and they were spotted by a truck driver who was in that parking lot for his 10-hour break. He called law enforcement, and when they arrived on the scene, Sorensen and Hadza immediately invited law enforcement into the RV. They were overeager to answer questions. They were friendly. They offered law enforcement cookies. They were not acting the way people typically act when they're being investigated by law enforcement. Inside of the RV, there was a third person. It was a young woman whose hair was pulled back into a greasy, dirty bun. She was pale, but her face was heavily made up, and she was avoiding eye contact with law enforcement. At one point, Sorensen and Hadza pointed out the RV window to a landmark that they could see in the distance, and they said they wanted to go visit it that day. It was at that moment that this young woman was able to finally make eye contact with law enforcement and indicate that she needed help. When law enforcement took her outside of the RV, she shared a truly appalling story. She shared that about 2 weeks earlier, she had been abducted by Sorensen and Hadza from her home in Iowa. In that span, she had been beaten, she had been raped, and they had burned her with metal objects that they had heated on the RV stove. At one point, she had been able to escape, but they chased her down, re-abducted her, and brought her back to the RV where they jammed nails into the soles of her feet and tore the soles of her feet open so she would not be able to run away again. They had also posted ads for her on Craigslist and were selling her to men that were paying to come to the RV and rape her. She had not eaten in a week. She could not remember the last time she had had something to drink. And she truly thought she was going to die. And it was that fear of dying that gave her the courage to approach law enforcement. The doctors said that had she not received medical treatment within a matter of days, she would have died, thanks to the torture and malnutrition she had been experiencing. And that is what sex trafficking can look like in the United States. So in response to this crime, Truckers Against Trafficking recognized that members of the trucking industry, thanks to their sheer numbers, their extensive travels, and the nature of their jobs, were a key strategic ally in this fight against this crime. Because of the nature of their jobs, truck drivers are in a position to be the eyes and ears of law enforcement out on the road. And truck drivers are very often in places where traffickers might take their victims in order to sell them. Places like gas stations or truck stops or hotels or other rest areas. And we thought, what would happen if truck drivers were trained to recognize human trafficking and they knew how to report it? Imagine how many victims could be recovered and how many lives could be saved. And that is TAT's goal. We also recognize that members of the busing and energy industries were strategic allies in this fight. And as such, Truckers Against Trafficking seeks to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of the trucking, busing, and energy industries to combat human trafficking in the course of their everyday jobs. And we have 3 goals that we're working on in order to accomplish this. First, we want to saturate the industries we work with our training materials. We have developed several different industry-specific trainings, including documentary-style training videos, brochures, wallet cards that list red flag indicators of trafficking, and it provides the National Human Trafficking Hotline number. We have window decals, brochures, and all of these materials we have created are completely free of charge. We just want to get them into as many hands as possible to help educate the workforce on this issue. We have also created a mobile app, which all of you can download right now if you would like. It's also free. It's available for both Android and Apple. It has our documentary on there. It also has those red flag indicators, and it has a link to the National Human Trafficking Hotline if you needed to report any suspicious activity. Our second goal is to partner with law enforcement and government agencies to help facilitate investigations into human trafficking. TAT has worked with state agencies to co-create models where their jobs intersect with industry professionals. We regularly facilitate what we refer to as coalition builds, where members of the private sector can come together with members of the public sector and find ways to close loopholes that traffickers exploit. We also work with companies and encourage them to adopt anti-trafficking in persons policies with a demand reduction focus. This is such a great approach for companies to take as far as risk management is concerned, because the FMCSA is actively enforcing a law that imposes a lifelong ban on CDL holders who use a commercial vehicle to commit the crime of human trafficking. Companies also love this policy because it shows that they are committed to the fight against human trafficking, and it also shows any instance where an employee uses company time or company product to purchase commercial sex will not be tolerated. We also try to marshal the resources of our partners to commit this crime. We are very fortunate to have several corporate sponsors that we work with that offer their time, expertise, and funding in order to help further TAT's mission. We are also especially thankful for our North Star sponsors who have gone above and beyond in making sure they leverage their networks to increase awareness on the issue of human trafficking. And people do not have to be part of a company in order to support TAT's mission. We have several individual donors who have found ways to use their own personal networks in order to increase awareness of trafficking in their communities and help support TAT's mission. The exciting thing is all these people working together is making a difference. To date, we have over 1.5 million professional drivers who have completed the Truckers Against Trafficking training and have registered on our website. This has resulted, yes, it's very exciting. We all cheered when we reached that 1.5. What's really exciting is that that has resulted in thousands of calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And when you think about that, that means that thousands of human trafficking victims' lives have been positively impacted. In fact, some data we received from the National Human Trafficking Hotline shows that over 41% of calls that truckers made to the hotline involve victims who are minors. This shows that truckers are in the right place at the right time, and they are willing to make these life-saving phone calls. And this is TAT in action. These individuals pictured here are industry professionals who are recipients of our Harriet Tubman Award. The Harriet Tubman Award is TAT's highest honor that we give to an industry professional who has intervened on behalf of a trafficking victim. Pictured on the far right is Kevin Kimmel. Kevin Kimmel is that truck driver that I described earlier who was in the parking lot that saw the RV where Sorensen and Hadza were holding that young woman captive. And if we can get it to work, I'll let him go ahead and tell his story.
So I was filling out my paperwork and two spots over to the car. Just moved back in the front lot.
Whew, nice light little video for the end of your day, right? All right, so how can you all get involved? What are we looking for at Truckers Against Trafficking? So first and foremost, if you're here and you're a part of a company today, we would love for you to think about how your company can integrate TATS training and our messaging into your safety culture. We also encourage anybody in a company to think about how they could adopt some of those anti-trafficking in persons policies I described earlier with that demand reduction focus. We have to understand that if there were no buyers, there would be no victims, and we could put an end to sex trafficking. And then finally, we want you all to spread the word. Think about who at your company is in a position to make some of those decisions about incorporating TATS training materials into your company culture. Think about some of the other industry professionals that you work with, and think about how you can share with them what your company is doing about human trafficking and get them thinking about what they could do to fight human trafficking. And you can also spread the word in your own personal lives. You can take what you learned today back to your own communities and share with your friends and family what you've learned about trafficking. Children in particular need to hear this message, and they need to hear it from adults that they know care about them and who they can trust. Human trafficking is one of the greatest human rights violations of our time. I know it feels like a huge issue. I know it feels overwhelming, but you all have taken a really important first step in coming here and learning more about it and starting to get those wheels turning, thinking about what you can do to move forward and to start making a difference. You, as members of the transportation industry, are key allies in this fight, and we are so grateful for you. We're so grateful for your partnership. Thank you all for sticking around today. I know it's been a long couple of days. I appreciate your time. I'll be here for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, and I hope you all have safe travels home. Thank you very much.